Thank you very, very much. We didn't even provide you popcorn, and you have showed up. You made me immensely happy. I'm very, very, very proud and pleased that SFU and my Department of Communication, which is now called the School of Communication, has invited me to come and give this talk. And there is no more pleasurable for a former student of a program to have gotten an invitation like this and to have a hall full of audiences to be able to speak to them. And this is just a wonderful moment for me in my life. And I want to say a little bit more about Dallas, but first let me thank all of the people that were behind the organization. Pat Howard, who was actually working on our PhD fieldwork when I was finishing up my thesis, and Chao Yushi, who is a professor here. I met her at many conferences. She is leading this effort now. And Diana Lung, who has been dealing with every one of the details related to my trip, and I'm very thankful for all of your hard work behind this. So this is a great team, obviously, in your School of Communication, Brian, so please take good care of them. He's the dean. I want to begin this by this is, I think, a very Indian thing to do as well, by paying tribute to my teacher, that is Professor Dallas Smythe, who taught me political economy of communication, which this makes it doubly meaningful for me to be not only coming to my alma mater, but to have his daughter here in the audience, Carol Kurgan, who I met when she was trying to learn to ride horses in the Langley home. And she still remembered that, my visit to their house. And let me also recognize before I start my little talk that I have many members of my family. True to the Indian tradition, my family has showed up here, which is great. And this is also the best way to watch a movie, right? My two nephews sitting in the front row, Rajesh and Kiran, it's special that they've showed up. And Rajesh, it is particularly noteworthy that this is his 15th birthday, and he made time to listen to a lecture by his Dodappa. Now that is important. Thank you. Now, this is also my second home. Vancouver is the place that I came to as a landed immigrant back in 1969. And not knowing anything about Canada, I thought I would come here and make films. And foolish that I was, right? Young and foolish and adventurous. I came here primarily because Canada had this wonderful reputation for having, the National Film Board of Canada and the short films and documentaries. And my exposure to documentaries actually in India was in the back of a van, a UNESCO van, where they showed National Film Board made documentaries. So I had all of this stuff in my head, and I showed up in the wrong place in the world, or wrong part of the country. But Vancouver still has a very special place in my heart. And I came here basically because my brother, who was a professor at UBC, and his wife, Rajinder, who is probably not here, sponsored me to come. And otherwise it would have been impossible for me to come across the 7 seas, as my mother used to say. So I owe a deep debt of gratitude for what they've done to help me get educated in Canada. I'm also a product of the public school education in this country, which is under attack all over the world, as you all know. And SFU in those days was an incredibly accessible institution. Those of you who are studying at SFU would get a big kick out of this. My tuition fees at SFU were $65 a semester. And that is a tremendous value that Canada has always had to educate working class kids. And that, I think, is a deep threat, not only in this country, but also in the United States. So I hope all of you will go and fight to keep the tuition fees low. Now, let me just start very quickly, say a couple of things about Dallas Smythe and my work with him. When I came here, I came from University of Washington, where the dominant model of doing communications research was logical positivism, very much behaviorist kind of a tradition. And I intentionally picked SFU School of Communication because Dr. Smythe was here, and I wanted to do a completely different turn in my own life, just as he had turned many times in his life pursuing knowledge. And he, I think, had a very soft spot for third world students. and was very, very supportive and understanding and embracing of my own interests, both in television and film, and was incredibly helpful in those short 3 years that I spent at SFU in getting me to finish the dissertation, the kind of dissertation that I wanted to write. And I can't really go too much into that at this point, but he had also come to Marxism very late in his life. And I came from a bourgeois family in India. And this was a revelation to study Marxism, not just with Dallas, but also with another professor on this campus, my name Dr. Hari Sharma, who is an emeritus now, but he's not here. And Dallas, one of the striking things about Dallas Smythe was, when I went to him and I said, I want to do this project on India, and I was still thinking about something on Indian cinema, and he said, I don't really know anything about India. That country baffles me. You should simply go to Hari Sharma and learn from him. So I studied with Hari for a whole year, and Hari taught me the essence of Marxism, I think, and then Dallas helped me to understand or apply that to communications. In that particular period when I was working with Dallas, he was also invited by Mao Zedong at least twice. So he was very excited about China. And he wrote that essay called After Bicycles What? And that's an incredibly important essay. For those of you who have not read it, you should try to take a good look at it. It is really about what's going on in the world now. And it is particularly about the Chinese bureaucracy and the party not having a clue as to how to deal with communications. And it's telling. He predicted what was going to happen in China back in 1978. And looking at what the bureaucracy was saying about communications and the kind of gaps in their own understanding of this technology and the medium. We spent a lot of time talking, and he was very, very excited to privately teach me, because I really didn't take a lot of classes from him. Because in 2 years of coursework, you don't have much time. But he taught me one thing that is very valuable in dealing with students. He made the time for me so that I could go and spend the time with him in his office to learn. And as he was very excited about Mao and his own work in China, I think one of the books that he made me read was Mao's book with lectures that were given to the peasantry. And he really wanted me to understand this concept called contradiction. And in Marxism, which is very thickly laden with Germanic language, and when it's translated to English, it's really very hard to understand. So he said, look, Mao was talking to the peasants, but he was actually talking about Marxism to the peasantry. You would relate to that. So every time I would read something that was written by Mao, I would go back to him. It was an incredibly good discussion with him. I understood what Mao was trying to do, because I was also from a village. So the other thing that he taught me was about mentoring students and young faculty. And I think that's really an important lesson for me that I learned indirectly by the amount of time that he gave me and the number of times he met with me outside the campus. And every time I went to his house, I think he actually made me a meal once, which was made out of beans. And I couldn't help miss the irony, because his own PhD dissertation was on, I think, something related to the beans. Now, I was drawn to politics on SFU campus. It was inevitable in those days because racism was on ascendancy, and so those of us who had come from the third world were confronted by that on a daily basis. And one of the things that was remarkable about Dallas Smythe as my teacher was anything that we did on campus, he was sitting in the front row, symbolically to support what we did. We organized the South Asian Students Association on campus to get away from the song and dance thing that the Indian Association was doing, to actually do some political work on campus. And SASA is that old, if SASA is still around. And Hari was one of the advisors for that. And when we did the Festschrift for Dallas, the three of us worked on it, Vinny Moscow, Janet Wasco, and I, and we did a celebration for him in Chicago. Smythe actually came to Chicago to be at this celebration. He hated planes. So he actually took a train all the way from here to a suburb of Chicago. And Roja and I went and picked him up. And we put him up in a bed and breakfast place on campus, near campus, because he didn't want to stay in a multinationally run hotel. And we brought him home, and I had many of my students who were working with me in political economy for this dinner, and Roja had made a very expansive dinner for that night. And we took several pictures with him. We called it the 3 generations of political economists. I wish I had brought that picture to show you. It was just a wonderful moment where he actually saw that his work was going to be continued with many men and women who were being trained at other universities, which is one of the only perks that I think teachers have. It's the legacy that you leave is with your students. Okay, now, one last comment about Dallas, and then I will turn to my presentation. I'm going to be talking about culture, politics, and aesthetics to some extent. Dallas always said political economy's strength is to actually study the macro issues, policy, structure, power, and those kinds of things, which intersect in specific ways in different societies. So class, caste, and those kinds of issues would make sense to him. But when it came to actually studying culture, he would always tell me it's messy. Ideology is messy, right? But he never discouraged me from pursuing the meshing of those things in my own work. In fact, in a preface that he wrote to the prologue that he wrote to my first book on Canadian cinema, he actually praises me for not giving up the strength that I have in doing analysis of culture and cultural analysis of film. So while he was himself concerned about the messiness of looking at content, if you will, and the aesthetic issues, he wouldn't deter me from doing it. So I'm very thankful for that teacher who supported me to develop in the way that I wanted to develop. Okay. Let me, I think, set this up first. You got to look at Aishwarya first. A complicated title to talk about Indian cinema, to calling it Bollywood or Globalwood. Diana, are you okay? And trying to talk about Indian popular cinema in the era of globalization creates all sorts of complexities, so I will try to do the very best I can in the amount of time that has been allocated to me. Let me begin by making some observations about globalization, because this has become the buzzword of our time. It means different things for different people, but it is, although many of us have different orientations to what this might mean, but it's also a contested term by different people, because if you look at what happened in Seattle, Davos, and other places all over the world, the social movements across the world have tried to redefine that term to empower themselves in order to push the changes that are taking place in a positive social development way. But the term itself is not really new, while it is bandied about in journalism a lot. It appears as though it got bandied about a lot in the last 5 years. But the term globalized quota apparently first appeared in The Economist magazine. Economist is a conservative magazine which promotes free trade, quote unquote free trade, but it is a very well-written magazine. And apparently they used the term globalized quota back in 1959, and it has stuck with us. Now, what is really interesting about this is that we have gone from a severely critical view that we took about Marshall McLuhan's global village to embracing this term called globalization in a very, very quick way, particularly the academy. I mean, even including my own work. I've used the term globalization and sometimes unthinkingly about what it might mean in the overall sense of that term. It has come to be accepted to mean many things, especially all the good, the bad, and the ugly as the new millennium began. Now, the adaptation of this term not only in the English language, but in many other languages has moved at a very dizzying speed, I think. Armand Mattelart, in a very pithy way, has said in an article that he published that we need to think about globalization as a historical process, a project and a belief. I think it gets it. That is, it's a historical process that began many, many years ago with the development of capitalism. capitalism and imperialism are very precise terms, whereas globalization is not a precise term. Now, it is a project. It is a project that is actually engineered to a large extent, led by the United States, with its attendant institutions called the IMF and the World Bank, and many other things that are policy related and that drive this project in very certain directions. But it's also a belief in the sense that it is undergirded by the idea that the only system that could survive or could thrive is capitalism or monopoly capitalism. Now, if we keep that frame of reference in mind, globalization is going to look differently to us. Not the one where well-to-do professors in North America sit with single malt scotch and listen to sitar while they're in Vancouver, British Columbia. Now, the term, as the contests over the meaning of the term develops, given labor unions and other social movements are coming in conflict with the agenda of capital, now the boundaries and limits of what that term could mean and who this term would actually signify about are always in competition. But it is a systemic issue. I mean, I want to drive this towards where Dallas would be. We need to think about what are the systemic tendencies of this thing called globalization, who is leading this, in whose interest are they leading this, with what effect possibly, and on whom this effect would actually take place. Now, while the United States and other advanced capitalist countries are actually leading this effort, but there are contradictions among them. They don't always agree with each other. You have different trade blocs that have emerged. The NAFTA, for example, here in the North American Free Trade Agreement, the European Economic Community. Now, the third world, many nations, like big countries like China, India, particularly India and Brazil, have aligned themselves in trying to rework the system or rework the policy at the international level. China is a particularly interesting problem, but I want to come to that in a minute. Now, Dallas spent a lot of time talking about dependency and interdependency. Now, that is also those terms, while dependency is not really heavily used anymore, both in conceptual work that takes place in political economy, but even in journalistic terms or in the journalistic community, that is not used at all. In fact, what gets used is the interdependence of nation states, as though interdependence happens in a very idealized situation. Now, I argue that it is really heavily racialized discourse. Underneath all of that, particularly when you focus on China and India, the discourse that you find in the popular media is that it is about China being a threat and somehow India being a threat. Not because they have the atomic weapon, but because they have 1 billion people and growing fast. And China and India are going to be the significant threat to the world system that is led by the advanced capitalist countries. And I think that is really racialized in my view. The regime that is running in China is not a threat to the world system or the United States. They're partners. I don't know if Professor Zhao would agree with me on that.